The concept of non-duality, or Advaita, stems from the view that everything that appears separate is actually a manifestation of a single reality. In this understanding, subject and object, body and soul, even matter and consciousness, are not two distinct entities, but two sides of the same truth. Duality is merely a result of limited human perception, like a shadow appearing separate from its light source. The philosophy of Advaita Vedanta, taught by Adi Shankara in the 8th century, asserts that the universe is a play of pure consciousness, or Brahman. All forms, colors, and phenomena are merely Maya, perceptual illusions that arise within the universal consciousness. Within this framework, humans are not seeking God outside themselves, but are in the process of recognizing that they themselves are expressions of that same divine consciousness. This idea also appears in other traditions. In Neoplatonism, Plotinus referred to the One as the source of all existence, from which reality is derived through the process of emanation. In Taoism, the concept of Tao describes the cosmic stream of consciousness that gives birth to all things without being separated from them. Even in Islamic mysticism, Ibn Arabi's Wahdat al-Wujud states that there is only one true being, God, and everything is his reflection. Non-duality can also be understood from a scientific perspective. When one observes the world, the brain interprets light waves, sound vibrations, and sensory signals into a seemingly concrete reality. However, at the subatomic level, there are no definite shapes or colors, only energy fields and probabilities. In other words, the world we experience is merely a projection of consciousness organizing quantum information into sensory experience. The crisis of dualism that separates observer and observed has now become a crisis in modern science. If everything ultimately originates from a single universal consciousness, then observation is not a passive process, but rather a creative act of consciousness itself. The philosophy of non-duality provides a new direction, that reality is not something to be mastered, but rather something to be realized. In the depths of meditation, when the mind stops classifying and judging, one can experience a brief moment of oneness, a limitless awareness in which the self and the world dissolve into a single experience. It is at this point that non-duality is no longer a theory, but a direct experience of the unity of existence. As science advances, more and more scientists and philosophers are realizing that consciousness may not be a byproduct of the brain, but rather a fundamental field that underlies all of reality. The materialistic paradigm that has dominated science for centuries is beginning to be cracked by discoveries that are difficult to explain without implicating the role of consciousness itself. Max Planck, the father of quantum physics, once stated, "I consider consciousness to be fundamental. Everything we consider to be matter is merely the result of consciousness." This statement represents a profound paradigm shift from viewing the universe as a physical machine to viewing the cosmos as a living web of consciousness. Physicist David Bohm, using the concept of implicate order, explained that behind the explicated phenomenal world, there is a hidden order in which all things are interconnected and inseparable. In this order, particles, energy, even space and time are merely expressions of a cosmic consciousness that unfolds outward and inward. Everything is not an independent entity, but rather a wave in the ocean of universal consciousness. This view is reinforced by modern panpsychism, as proposed by philosopher Philip Goff and the Galileo Commission Report 2020. According to him, consciousness is not merely a result of the complexity of neurons, but an intrinsic property of the entire universe. Electrons, atoms, and even quantum fields possess a level of proto-consciousness, forming a unified existence at every scale of reality. In neuroscience, the Integrated Information Theory, IIT, developed by Giulio Tononi, states that consciousness arises from a system's ability to integrate information in a complex and comprehensive manner. If the universe is viewed as a giant, interconnected information system, as described in the holographic universe theory, then consciousness is no longer exclusive to the brain, but is a fundamental structure of reality itself. Some physicists, such as Roger Penrose and Stuart Hameroff, have even proposed a quantum model of consciousness, ORC-R theory, in which microtubules within neurons function as quantum resonators that allow the brain to access subtler levels of reality. Thus, the brain is not the creator of consciousness, but rather a biological antenna that captures and transmits the universal field of consciousness. In this view, all of existence is a field of consciousness that is constantly observing and creating itself. Every thought, emotion, and perception is not a separate activity, but rather a vibrating wave in the ocean of cosmic consciousness. Philosophy and physics began to converge in one understanding that the basis of reality is not matter, but consciousness vibrating in all directions, still and dynamic at the same time, empty and full.
Long before modern science discovered quantum principles and information theory, ancient civilizations possessed profound insights into the nature of the unity of the cosmos and consciousness. In Hermetic texts, such as the Corpus Hermetica and the Kybalion, it is stated that the first principle of all natural law is mentalism. All is mind. The universe, in the Hermetic view, is not a collection of material objects, but rather the living mind of divine consciousness that radiates itself in the form of energy, vibrations, and matter. Hermetic teachings describe the process of creation as a flow of energy from the ineffable to particular forms. This reflects the modern concept of a universal quantum field, where every particle is a fluctuation of invisible energy. The second principle, correspondence, as above, so below, parallels the holographic principle in theoretical physics. The micro and macro structures of the universe are mirror images of each other. The Kabbalistic tradition also states that all existence emanates from Ein Sof, an infinite source that projects reality through the 10 Sephirot, or dimensions of divine consciousness. Within this framework, creation is not a single event, but rather a continuous process in which consciousness unfolds and self-discloses into forms of experience. This view resonates in David Bohm's concept of implicate order, in which the universe continually unfolds from a hidden order. Meanwhile, Sufism speaks of Wadat al-Wujud, the unity of existence. According to Ibn Arabi, God did not create the universe from without, but rather manifests himself through every atom of existence. In every breath, every pulse, and every phenomenon, there is tajalli, the continuous unfolding of divine consciousness. This aligns with the idea that the universe is a conscious system that continually renews itself in real time. In Eastern mystical practices, such as Vedantic meditation, Zazen in Zen, and Taoist contemplation, the peak experience of non-duality is always marked by the disappearance of the boundary between observer and observed. Modern neuroscience now confirms that when one enters a state of heightened consciousness, samadhi or fana, activity in the brain's default mode network, the center that creates the sense of I, decreases dramatically. The result is an experience of infinite unity, a state in which the individual self merges into the universal presence. Thus, modern science and ancient mystical traditions speak different languages to explain the same thing. Reality is not a separate material structure, but rather a dynamic expression of undivided consciousness. Hermeticism calls it divine mind. Kabbalah calls it infinite light. Sufism calls it absolute being, while quantum physics calls it the zero energy field, but they all point to the same universal principle. Consciousness is the source, and all that exists is its manifestation.
20th century physicists discovered that reality is not as simple as Newton once imagined. The world is not composed of tiny, solid, definite objects, but rather of particles that behave like waves of probability. Their existence only becomes apparent when observed. This phenomenon was first demonstrated by the double-slit experiment, in which electrons exhibit wave properties when unobserved, but behave as particles when an observer is present. This experiment raised a question that shook the very foundations of scientific metaphysics. Does the observer's consciousness play a role in creating reality? Eugene Wigner, a Nobel Prize winner in physics, argued that the process of observation does not simply record reality, but causes it to occur. In quantum terms, measurement transforms a superposition, a state in which a particle exists in multiple possibilities, into a single actual outcome. John Archibald Wheeler expanded on this idea with his theory of the participatory universe. The universe is not a passive entity existing separately from us, but rather a participatory reality, in which consciousness is an integral part of the mechanism of creation. The universe, in his view, is a conscious system that knows itself through the observation of the living beings within it. On a deeper scale, Heisenberg's uncertainty principle asserts that we cannot simultaneously know the exact position and momentum of a particle. This means there is no objective reality that exists independently of an observer, only a dynamic relationship between consciousness and energy. Some modern interpretations, such as the holographic theory, Susskind and Tuft, and the many worlds interpretation, Hugh Everett, suggest that the entire universe is a system of interfering quantum information, forming a structure of reality that depends on the consciousness of the observer. In other words, we do not live in a world that is discovered, but in a world that is being consciously realized into existence. The consequences of this view are profound. The boundaries between physics and metaphysics begin to blur. If observation determines reality, then consciousness is the ontological foundation of the universe, not simply a biological phenomenon. In this context, non-duality and quantum mechanics embrace each other. Both teach that there is no outside and inside, no me and world, but rather a single consciousness that pulsates as the universe. If quantum reality teaches that the universe is participatory, and mystical traditions affirm that consciousness is the basis of all existence, then a new paradigm emerges: non-dual cosmology. In this cosmology, there is no essential distinction between observer and observed, spirit and matter, science and spirituality. Everything is an expression of a single consciousness that manifests itself through frequency, vibration, and information. This view challenges the long-held assumption of materialist philosophy that consciousness arises from the complexity of the brain. Instead, non-dual cosmology holds that matter arises from consciousness. Universal consciousness, through the mechanism of quantum resonance, reduces itself to energy, and from energy comes particles, atoms, stars, and life. The universe is not a meaningless random machine, but a conscious organism, experiencing and recognizing itself through all its forms. Physicist John Wheeler once said, "The universe is a self-excited circuit. We are tiny parts of the universe that have become aware of being aware." In the language of non-duality, human consciousness is a tiny mirror of cosmic consciousness. Every experience, thought, and feeling is a subtle vibration of a greater reality which gazes upon itself through millions of human eyes. In this view, evolution is not merely a biological process, but the evolution of consciousness, from inert matter to life, from instinctive awareness to self-reflection, and finally to a universal consciousness that realizes its oneness with all existence. Modern science begins to touch on this in complex systems theory, in quantum neuroscience, that life and mind emerge when information reaches a very high level of integration. At the highest point of integration, the boundary between self and cosmos disappears. The philosophy of non-duality helps us understand that spiritual attainment is not an escape from the world, but rather a realization of oneness with the world itself. When the observer understands that he or she is not a separate entity, but rather part of a universal consciousness dancing in human form, reality transforms. Life becomes a sacred field where God experiences himself through every moment. In a scientific context, this means that humans are not passive observers, but co-creators of reality. Thoughts, intentions, and attention have a direct effect on the information structures that make up the quantum world. In a spiritual context, this is the realization that the observer and the seen are one. Ultimately, non-dual cosmology brings us back to the beginning, to unity. There are no longer boundaries between physics and metaphysics, between atom and soul, between God and creation. All is the vibration of eternal consciousness, gazing at itself from every angle of existence. The universe, in its deepest sense, is an endless mirror of God aware of itself. And therein lies humanity, not as dust in the cosmos, but as cosmic consciousness awakening in human form.